All right, so today we're going to be looking at juvenile justice in India.
Okay.
You sent over some really interesting articles,
Yeah.
and it seems like you're interested in going a bit deeper
Yeah, definitely beyond the basics.
beyond the basics. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're talking about, how age and the type of crime and even past legal decisions
Um,
all kind of factor into how India handles these cases.
Absolutely.
So let's jump in
Yeah, let's get started.
and see what we can uncover.
It's such a fascinating area of law because it's constantly, requiring us to think about how we balance accountability with the potential for rehabilitation,
Right.
especially when you're dealing with,
Yeah, when young people are involved.
yeah, exactly.
And sometimes a real life case really throws all those complexities into focus.
Yeah.
The Naya article you sent starts with this crazy story about a 17-year-old driver in Pune who caused a car crash that killed 2 people.
Oh, wow.
It made headlines everywhere.
Yeah, I remember that. That was a big case, and the public was outraged because the driver was initially released on bail,
Right.
and the conditions seemed pretty lenient to a lot of people.
Yeah, totally.
No.
And that outrage actually led to the bail being canceled.
Yeah, they were canceled because of the public pressure.
It just shows you how strong public opinion can be, but it also makes you wonder,
Absolutely.
how does India actually deal with minors who break the law?
Well, it all comes down to this piece of legislation called the Juvenile Justice Act of 2015.
Okay.
It's kind of like the rule book for how this system handles these cases.
So Juvenile Justice Act of 2015, got it.
Yeah.
And both the Naya article and the one from the Law Times Journal mention this act. Is that where this whole idea of a child in conflict with law comes from?
That's right.
Okay.
It's a deliberate shift in language, moving away from labeling young people as criminals.
I see.
It recognizes them as children who may have made bad choices, but still have the potential for change.
So it's all about focusing on rehabilitation rather than just punishment.
Exactly. And the act is full of provisions that support this approach.
Oh.
For example, did you know that if a minor is arrested, they can't be held in a regular jail?
Oh, wow.
They have to be taken to a special juvenile unit or handed over to a child welfare officer within 24 hours.
Whoa, that's a big difference from how adults are treated.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And they can't just sit around waiting either.
Right.
The act requires that they be brought before the Juvenile Justice Board quickly.
Okay.
This board is made up of specialists who decide how each case should be handled.
Okay, so there's this whole separate system set up for dealing with minors.
Yeah, the whole system.
What's the reasoning behind that?
Well, a lot of it is rooted in this principle of doli incapax.
Okay.
It's a fancy legal term. But it basically means that a child, because of their age and developmental stage, can't be held fully responsible for their actions in the same way an adult can.
So they might not fully understand the consequences of what they're doing?
Precisely. And that's why the focus is on helping them learn from their mistakes and make better choices in the future rather than just throwing them in jail.
That makes sense. But
Yeah.
doesn't it get complicated?
It does.
I mean, what about when a young person commits a really serious crime?
Right.
Surely there has to be some accountability for that, right?
That's where things get more interesting. And that's where this whole concept of heinous crimes comes in.
Okay.
We'll dive into that in just a bit.
Right.
But first, let's talk about how the Juvenile Justice Act actually categorizes different types of crimes.
Okay, let's unpack that.
So the Act divides offenses committed by minors into 3 categories: petty, serious, and heinous.
Got it.
For petty crimes, things like minor theft or vandalism, the focus is heavily on rehabilitation.
Okay.
They might be placed under probation, which means they have to follow certain rules and check in with a probation officer.
Okay.
They might also be required to do community service or participate in counseling.
So it's about giving them a chance to make amends and get back on track.
Exactly. And for serious crimes, the consequences can be more significant,
Yeah.
but the emphasis is still on rehabilitation.
Okay.
They might be sent to an observation home,
Okay.
which is kind of like a residential facility where they receive education, counseling, and vocational training.
Gotcha. Okay, I'm with you so far. But what about those heinous crimes you mentioned?
Right.
Where does the line get drawn there?
Well, heinous crimes are the most serious category.
Right.
We're talking about things like murder, rape, and other offenses that carry a heavy penalty for adults.
Yeah.
And that's where things can get really tricky because even though the Juvenile Justice Act is designed to protect children,
Right.
it also acknowledges that there are situations where a young person's actions might be so severe that they warrant a different approach.
So does that mean they could potentially be treated as an adult in those cases?
It's possible.
Okay.
The Act allows for a preliminary inquiry by the Juvenile Justice Board in cases where a young person between the ages of 16 and 18 has committed a heinous crime. Basically, the board looks into the details of the case and tries to assess things like the severity of the crime, the young person's mental state, and their understanding of the consequences of their actions.
It sounds like a really tough job.
It definitely is.
Right.
And if the board decides that it's warranted, they can transfer the case to a children's court where the young person might be tried as an adult.
Wow. So even though the Juvenile Justice Act is in place, there are still circumstances where a young person could end up facing the full force of the law.
Yes, but there are still safeguards in place.
Okay.
Even in a children's court, the trial has to be conducted in a child-friendly atmosphere, and certain punishments like life imprisonment or the death penalty are completely off the table for juveniles.
Okay, so there's still a recognition that they're not adults,
Exactly.
even if they're being tried in a more serious court.
Right.
And that brings us back to the Poon case we were talking about earlier.
Uh-huh.
Remember, the driver was 17 years old? So based on what we've been discussing, it sounds like his case would likely be handled in a children's court, right?
That's a good assumption.
Right.
But remember, even though he might be tried in a children's court, the focus would still be on restorative justice rather than harsh punishment.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So even in a case as tragic as this one where lives were lost,
Right.
the system is still geared towards giving young offenders a chance to turn their lives around?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It recognizes that young people, even those who have made terrible mistakes, still have the potential for change and rehabilitation.
Yeah.
But, like I mentioned earlier, there's often a tension between this approach and public pressure for harsher punishments, especially in high-profile cases.
You're right. It makes you wonder how India's juvenile justice system has evolved to reach this point. Is it something that's always been there, or has it changed over time?
Great question. It definitely has a history, and it's actually been through a lot of changes to get to where it is today.
Okay, so let's talk about that history then.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know more.
Let's do it.
All right.
Okay. Well, the Law Times Journal article you sent actually dives into that history, and it's pretty fascinating. It starts way back in 1960 with the Children Act, which was like the first real attempt to create a separate system for handling young offenders.
So before 1960, were kids basically treated the same as adults in the legal system?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
There wasn't really a distinction. But the Children Act of 1960 was a big step forward because it recognized that children need to be treated differently.
Okay, that makes sense. But it sounds like things have changed quite a bit since then, right?
You bet. The article goes on to talk about the Juvenile Justice Act of 1986, which built on the foundation of the Children Act and introduced some new ideas like the concept of observation homes, where kids could be sent for rehabilitation instead of jail.
We touched on observation homes earlier. They sound like they played a really key role in the system.
They absolutely do.
Yeah.
And the way they function, the whole idea of creating a child-friendly environment focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment, really reflects a shift in thinking about how to deal with young offenders.
So things were moving in a more rehabilitative direction. Did it stop there?
Not at all. The article mentions that there are actually two more versions of the Juvenile Justice Act, one in 2000 and then the current one in 2015. Each update reflected a deeper understanding of child development and a stronger commitment to protecting children's rights.
It's amazing how much the thinking has evolved. What drove those changes?
A few things, actually.
Yeah.
One big influence was the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. India signed on to this convention in 1992, and it really set a new standard for how countries should treat children, including those who come into conflict with the law.
So India's laws were being shaped by global standards of child rights.
Exactly. And that's a really important point because it shows that the push for a more humane and rehabilitative approach to juvenile justice isn't just an Indian thing, it's a global movement.
I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. You've got changing social attitudes, international agreements, and these ongoing updates to the Juvenile Justice Act. It's all pushing the system in a more child-centered direction.
You got it. And it's interesting because even though the focus has shifted towards rehabilitation, there are still those really tough cases that make you question how far that leniency should go.
Yeah, the ones that spark public outrage and debate. Like, how does the system balance protecting the rights of a young offender with ensuring justice for the victims, especially in those heinous crimes we talked about?
You're hitting on a really crucial point. And that's where looking at specific legal cases can help us understand how the courts grapple with those tough questions.
Makes sense. Cases are like real-life examples of how the law plays out. So which ones should we look at?
Well, the Naya article you sent mentions a case called Kaku v. Union of India that really highlights this tension between rehabilitation and punishment.
Okay. What happened in that case?
This case involved a 13-year-old boy who was convicted of raping a 2-year-old girl. It was a horrific crime that sparked a lot of anger and calls for harsh punishment.
Oh, wow, that's just awful. It's hard to even imagine something like that. So what did the court decide?
The Supreme Court, while acknowledging the severity of the crime, ended up reducing the boy's sentence.
They reduced his sentence even for a crime like that. How could they do that?
Well, they cited specific sections of the Indian Penal Code that deal with criminal responsibility. Essentially, those sections say that children under a certain age can't be held criminally liable in the same way as adults.
So they were basically saying that because of his age, he couldn't be held fully responsible for his actions?
Exactly. And the court emphasized that when you're dealing with juveniles, the justice system has to consider both reformative and humanitarian perspectives. It's not just about punishment, it's also about recognizing that young people have a greater capacity for change and rehabilitation than adults.
So in this case, even though the crime was terrible, the court decided that focusing on the boy's potential for rehabilitation was more important than giving him a harsher punishment.
Right. They recognized that putting a 13-year-old boy in prison for a long time might not actually serve the interests of justice in the long run.
I can see how that would be a controversial decision. But what about cases where it seems like a young person does understand the consequences of their actions, like they planned something bad or knew they were doing something wrong?
That's a great question, and the Law Times Journal article actually mentions a case that addresses that very issue. It's Juvenile v. Union of India.
Okay, what happened in that case? Tell me more.
In this case, a child, and they don't specify the exact age in the article, threatened an adult with violence and then fatally stabbed someone. So it was a very serious crime.
It definitely sounds like it. What did the court decide in that case?
Well, they took a different approach than they did in the Kaku case. They actually convicted the child, emphasizing that he was of legal age and that the severity of the crime justified a conviction. They even rejected an appeal, meaning they were pretty firm in their decision.
So it seems like there are limits to how far the Doli Inca principle can go. If it's clear that a young person understood the consequences of their actions and still chose to commit a serious crime, the courts might be less lenient.
That's a good takeaway. It's all about finding that balance,
Yeah.
right? Protecting children, recognizing their developmental differences, but also making sure that there's accountability for serious wrongdoing.
It makes you wonder how the courts decide where to draw the line in each case. Is there a specific set of rules they follow, or is it more of a judgment call?
Well, there's the law itself, the Juvenile Justice Act, which provides a framework.
Yeah.
But then there's also case law, which means looking at previous decisions made by the courts to see how they've interpreted the law in similar situations.
Yeah.
And that's where things can get really nuanced.
Okay, so each case builds on the ones that came before it, shaping how the law is understood and applied. It sounds like a constantly evolving process.
Exactly. And the case of Satyadeo v. State of Uttar Pradesh illustrates this point really well.
Okay, what happened in Satyadea? I'm ready for another case.
This one is interesting because it dealt with a crime that was actually committed before the Juvenile Justice Act of 2000 was even put into place.
So before some of the current protections for juveniles even existed.
Right. But the court ruled that even though the crime happened before the act came into effect, if the person was under 18 at the time, they should still be treated as a juvenile under the act.
Wow, so the court applied the protections of the newer law even to a crime that happened under the older system.
Exactly. They basically said that the benefits of the Juvenile Justice Act, things like the focus on rehabilitation and the special procedures for handling juvenile cases, should apply retrospectively.
What does retrospectively mean?
It means that the law applies to past situations, even if those situations happened before the law was enacted. In this case, it meant giving the offender the benefit of the Juvenile Justice Act, even though the crime was committed before the act existed.
I see. So they're saying that the law is meant to protect juveniles regardless of when the crime occurred. That's a pretty big statement.
It is. And it shows how seriously the courts take the idea of protecting children's rights. They're willing to apply those protections even when it means going back and revisiting old cases.
It sounds like there's a real commitment to making sure that young offenders are treated fairly and given a chance at rehabilitation.
Yes, and that commitment has been tested quite a bit, especially in cases that grab public attention and generate a lot of strong emotions.
Right. Cases like the Nubaya case we talked about earlier, I remember that case sparked nationwide protests and calls for tougher laws against juvenile offenders.
Absolutely. And that public outcry actually led to a legal challenge to the very foundation of the Juvenile Justice Act.
Hmm.
The case is called Salil Bali v. Union of India, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Okay, so Salil Bali was a direct challenge to the Juvenile Justice Act. What were they arguing?
The people who brought the case wanted the age of juvenility lowered. Remember, under the current law, anyone under 18 is considered a juvenile. But they wanted to change that to 16, arguing that 16 and 17-year-olds who commit heinous crimes should be treated as adults.
Wow, that's a huge change. It would completely alter how a lot of cases are handled. So what did the Supreme Court decide?
They actually rejected the petition, which means they decided to keep the age of juvenility at 18.
So they upheld the core principle of the Juvenile Justice Act.
Exactly. And their reasoning was really interesting. They acknowledged the public anger and the desire for harsher punishments, especially in cases like Nirbhaya. But they ultimately decided that the Juvenile Justice Act is grounded in solid legal and constitutional principles, and they weren't willing to overturn it based on public pressure alone.
So they were basically saying that protecting the rights of children, even those who commit serious crimes, is more important than bending to public opinion.
Yes, and they even cited international law to support their decision, mentioning things like the Beijing Rules and the Riyadh Guidelines.
What are those?
They're basically international agreements that outline best practices for dealing with young offenders.
Yeah.
And they both support the idea of having separate justice systems for children and adults.
So the Supreme Court was saying that India's approach to juvenile justice is in line with global standards.
Right. And I think that's a really important takeaway from the Salil Bali case.
Hmm.
Even when faced with immense public pressure, the courts are often willing to stand by the principles of child rights and the belief that rehabilitation is possible, even for those who commit serious crimes.
It's a powerful statement about the value that India places on protecting its children. But it also makes you wonder, are there other factors beyond just the law and the courts that play into how juvenile justice works in India?
There absolutely are. Remember, the Law Times Journal article doesn't just focus on the legal stuff. It also talks about the social and psychological factors that contribute to juvenile delinquency.
Oh, right. It's not just about kids being bad. There are often deeper reasons why they might end up in trouble with the law.
Exactly. And the article talks about how early life experiences like exposure to violence or neglect can have a huge impact on a child's development and their likelihood of engaging in criminal behavior.
That makes sense. Trauma and instability can definitely lead to bad choices later on.
Absolutely. And it's not just about individual experiences. Social pressures and economic circumstances also play a big role. For example, if a child is growing up in poverty or surrounded by gang activity, they might be more likely to get involved in crime.
So it's like all these different factors can create a situation where a young person is more vulnerable to making bad decisions.
Yes, and the article really emphasizes that point. It's a reminder that juvenile delinquency isn't just a legal issue, it's a societal issue.
Right. And it means that addressing it requires more than just laws and punishments. It also needs social programs and support systems that can help address those root causes.
Exactly. And that actually leads us to another really concerning issue that the article highlights, the exploitation of children for criminal activities.
Oh, wait, what do you mean by exploitation?
Well, the article talks about how children, some as young as 6 to 10 years old, are being used by adults to commit crimes.
That's awful. What kind of crimes are we talking about?
It can be anything from petty theft to drug trafficking. The article gives examples of kids being forced to beg on the streets, to steal, or even to transport drugs.
That's heartbreaking. They're just kids. They're being manipulated and put in danger.
Exactly. And because they're so young, they might not even fully understand what you're doing or the risks involved. They're being taken advantage of.
It sounds like this is a major problem. What's being done to address it?
Well, the article argues that part of the solution lies in strengthening child protection systems. It's about identifying children who are at risk of exploitation and providing them with the support they need to stay safe.
It makes sense. If we can catch it early and provide those kids with alternative, maybe we can prevent them from being pulled into criminal activity in the first place.
Right. It's about creating a safety net that catches those who are falling through the cracks.
So we're talking about things like making sure kids are in school, that they have access to healthcare, and that there are social workers who can intervene if they see a child in a dangerous situation.
Exactly. It's about addressing those social and economic factors that we talked about earlier, the ones that make kids more vulnerable to exploitation.
This whole discussion about exploitation really makes you think about who we consider a child in need of care and protection.
That's a great observation.
Hmm.
And it's actually something that the Juvenile Justice Act of 2015 addressed directly. They expanded the definition of a child in need of care and protection quite a bit.
Really? How so?
Well, before 2015, it was mostly about kids who were abandoned or abused. But the 2015 Act broadened the definition to include situations where a child's guardians are unfit or unwilling to care for them, where the child is engaged in child labor, or where there's a risk of child marriage.
So they're recognizing that a child's need for protection goes beyond just physical safety.
Right. It's about acknowledging that things like emotional well-being, educational opportunities, and protection from exploitation are also crucial for a child's healthy development.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the legal framework, the history, the challenges, and even some of the social factors that play into juvenile justice in India. It's been a pretty eye-opening conversation.
It has. And it's amazing to see how much thought and effort has gone into creating a system that tries to balance accountability with rehabilitation, all while keeping the best interests of children at the forefront.
Absolutely. But we've mostly been talking about concepts and legal cases.
Mhm.
I'm curious about the practical side of things. How does all this actually play out in the real world?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And to really understand that, we need to talk about the places where a lot of this work happens. The observation homes.
Okay, observation homes. We keep coming back to those.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that they're not like regular jails, right?
Right. They're really not.
Okay.
The Law Times Journal article describes them as, like a key part of this non-penal approach to juvenile justice in India.
Yep.
Think of them more like specialized facilities that are designed to provide care, protection, and rehabilitation to young people who've come into conflict with the law.
So they're not about punishment. They're about helping these kids get back on track.
Exactly.
Okay.
They're meant to be places where young people can receive counseling, education, vocational training, and other support services to help them reintegrate into society.
That makes a lot of sense. What's the environment like in these homes?
Hmm.
Is it strict and regimented, or is it more relaxed?
Well, both the Naya article and the Law Times Journal article emphasize the importance of creating a child-friendly environment.
What does that actually look like?
Well, it means making sure that the space feels safe and supportive,
Okay.
not like a prison.
Yeah.
It's about helping the young people there understand the consequences of their actions,
Right.
develop positive coping mechanisms, and learn the skills they need to make better choices in the future.
It sounds like a much more holistic approach than just locking someone up and throwing away the key.
Exactly. And this child-friendly approach goes beyond just the physical environment.
Okay.
It also includes things like making sure they have access to legal aid, that their privacy is respected, and that they have opportunities to participate in recreational activities.
So it's really about treating them with dignity and recognizing that they're still kids even if they've made mistakes.
Precisely, it's about seeing them as individuals with complex needs
Right.
and the potential for positive change, not just as offenders.
It's fascinating to see how all these pieces fit together, the laws, the courts, the social context.
Yeah?
And these observation homes, it seems like India has put a lot of thought into creating a system that's genuinely focused on rehabilitation.
It has. And while there's always room for improvement,
Sure.
and the system is constantly evolving, it's clear that India is committed to upholding the rights of children, even those who've come into conflict with the law.
But let's be real, it's a tough balancing act.
It is,
Right.
very much so.
Ensuring accountability for crimes while also prioritizing rehabilitation. And we've seen how public opinion can sometimes clash with that approach, especially in those high-profile cases.
You're absolutely right. Finding the balance is the ongoing challenge.
Right.
But the fact that the legal framework and the court decisions consistently emphasize rehabilitation is a really positive sign.
It shows a belief in second chances, right? A
Mhm.
belief that young people can learn from their mistakes and become productive members of society.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that adolescence is a time of growth and change.
Yeah.
And even serious missteps don't necessarily define a person's entire future.
It makes you think about the role that society plays in all of this, too. I mean, beyond just the legal system, how can we as a community better support the goals of juvenile justice?
That's a crucial question. It's not just about laws and courts. It's about creating a society that provides opportunities for young people to thrive, that addresses the root causes of delinquency, and that offers support to those who've made mistakes and are trying to turn their lives around.
It sounds like it takes a village, right? Families, Schools, community organizations, everyone needs to play a part.
Absolutely. We need to create a culture that fosters empathy, understanding, and a belief in the potential for positive change, even in the most challenging circumstances.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways you hope our listeners walk away with?
Well, I think it's clear that India's juvenile justice system is a complex and constantly evolving area of law. It's been shaped by history, by international standards, and by a growing understanding of child development and the importance of rehabilitation.
And even though there are challenges and those tough cases that spark debate, the system is ultimately designed to protect children and give them a chance to make things right.
Exactly. And this deep dive leaves us with a question to ponder. How can society best ensure justice for victims while also upholding the principles of restorative justice for young offenders? It's something to think about as you continue to explore this topic.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's been a really insightful conversation.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.